Ever get that feeling when you look deep into the eyes of your pet, like there's so much more going on in there than we realize, like a whole world of thoughts and feelings and experiences that we just can't quite grasp?
Oh, absolutely. It's that spark of consciousness, that sense of an individual personality shining through that really makes you wonder about the depth of their inner lives.
Yeah, exactly. And today we're diving deep into this very question, exploring some truly remarkable accounts from Ernesto Bozzano's work. Do animals have souls? We're not just talking about cute animal antics here. This is about the possibility that animals might perceive things beyond our normal senses. Things like telepathy, maybe even the echoes of the past, hauntings, phenomena we typically associate with humans.
It's fascinating territory. And what's really cool about Bozzano's approach is that he doesn't just leap to supernatural conclusions. He carefully lays out the evidence, considers different interpretations, and ultimately aims to uncover some deeper truths about the nature of animal consciousness.
And trust me, listeners, there's some genuinely mind-blowing stories ahead. But don't worry, we're not going to bombard you with endless details or get lost in technical jargon. Our goal is to share the most compelling and thought-provoking elements of these accounts and to really make you think about the animals in your own life. What might they be experiencing that we're not even aware of?
Right. One of the first things Bozzano tackles is this idea of shared perceptions between humans and animals, those instances where they both seem to react to something unseen or unusual.
Like if you feel a sudden chill in an old house and your dog starts growling at an empty corner, is it possible that your feeling somehow triggered the dog's reaction?
Exactly. That's one initial hypothesis. He explores the idea of what he calls a hallucinatory explanation. The thought is that a human might experience a psychic impression of some kind and then unconsciously transmit that to an animal nearby, almost like a mental echo.
So basically, it's not that the animal is perceiving something directly, but rather reacting to a kind of psychic ripple emanating from the human?
That's the gist of it. It's an attempt to explain these occurrences within the realm of known psychological principles. But then Bozzano introduces a really intriguing counter-argument that kind of throws a wrench in that neat explanation. He points to cases where multiple individuals, sometimes complete strangers with no knowledge of a location's history, have independently perceived the same animal forms.
And to make things even more interesting, these apparitions, as he calls them, are sometimes identified as animals that actually lived and died in that very place, even if the people seeing them had no way of knowing that. It's like the animal's presence is somehow imprinted on the environment.
Precisely, and that's what makes these cases so compelling. It challenges the idea that it's all just in the human mind, a shared hallucination. If several individuals with no shared context are witnessing an animal form that aligns with a real animal from the past, an animal they weren't even aware of, it suggests a phenomenon existing outside of individual perception.
So what's Bozzano's take on this? Where does he go with this idea of multiple witnesses perceiving the same animal apparition?
Well, he suggests that these cases point to a possible animal subconscious, much like our own, but perhaps with extraordinary supernormal abilities, beyond our normal senses. And this opens up the possibility of what he terms veridical apparitions, genuine appearances of animal forms, or even their underlying essence, their souls.
Okay, now we're talking. This is getting into some seriously deep territory. To really get a grip on this, Bozzano dives into a bunch of really interesting case studies. Let's start with the experience of Mr. and Mrs. Haggard and their dog, Bob.
Okay, so picture this. Mr. Haggard has this vivid dream where his dog, Bob, is seriously injured. The next morning, Bob's gone missing, and later they find him dead, and get this, with injuries that eerily match those in the dream.
Wait, so he dreamt about his dog being hurt, and then it actually happened.
Yep.
That's chilling. But what makes this case particularly compelling is the timing, right?
Yes, exactly. The veterinarian determined that Bob's death likely happened at least 2 hours before Mr. Haggard had the dream. So it wasn't a case of him subconsciously picking up on something that was happening to Bob in real time. It was almost like the information was flowing in reverse from Bob to Mr. Haggard.
So the dog was somehow communicating his experience, his distress, even after he had passed away.
That's the conclusion that Bozzano draws, and it's a pretty powerful one. He points out that there was no other human involved who could have influenced Mr. Haggard's dream, making it a strong example of direct telepathic transmission between the animal and the human.
That's wild. It's like their bond, their connection, transcended even the physical separation of death.
And the next case involves Kayla Kasanye and her dog. Witnesses reported seeing her dog attacked and killed, and right around the same time she had a dream about the event. This one feels a little less clear-cut than the Haggard case, though, right?
Yeah, a little less definitive. Why is that?
Well, according to the source, the most likely explanation is that the dying dog's fear and anxiety were so strong that they triggered a telepathic impression in his owner's dream. But we can't totally rule out the possibility of clairvoyance, that her dream was a direct perception of the event as it was happening.
Right, I see. So it's possible, though perhaps less likely, that she was psychically witnessing the attack as it unfolded, rather than receiving a telepathic message from her dog.
Exactly. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Mr. F.W. Percival's experience with his mare, Windermere. This one really highlights the potential for animals to send out distress signals that humans can pick up on.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So picture this. Mr. Percival wakes up suddenly with this overwhelming sense of dread, this deep knowing that Windermere is in serious trouble and needs help. At first, he doesn't hear anything, but then he describes this intense sensation in his brain and nerves, almost like a desperate, silent cry for help. And what's really fascinating is that he instinctively knows the direction of Windermere's distress.
Wow. It's like he's receiving a psychic SOS signal. So, what happened? Did he find her?
Sadly, yes. Following that intuitive pull, that inner knowing, led him straight to where Windermere had drowned in the lake.
That's tragic. But isn't there also an account from Lady Carberry's coachman that backs up this story?
You got it. The coachman confirmed that Windermere had been perfectly healthy earlier that evening, and later they found her suddenly ill, with no one having gone near the stables in between. This really supports the idea that something unexpected and very serious happened to her, perfectly aligning with Mr. Percival's sudden premonition of danger.
That's amazing. It's like a perfect storm of evidence pointing to a genuine connection between a human and an animal in distress.
And it's a reminder that these connections might operate in ways we don't fully understand, going beyond our normal senses. Now, the next case is about Lady Carberry herself and a premonition she had concerning her dog. It really highlights how these impressions might not always be straightforward and literal.
Oh, this is the one where her intuition saved her dog's life, right?
Right. You're thinking of the right one. So Lady Carberry suddenly gets this intense feeling of danger, specifically related to fire. And this feeling is so strong that she starts checking her entire house, eventually discovering her dog trapped in, of all places, the oven flue.
An oven flue. Talk about a close call. But the source material suggests that this premonition wasn't as direct as it first appears, right? It's like she had a vision of her dog specifically stuck in that flue.
Exactly. The core message, the feeling of danger, was accurate. But the way it manifested in her mind was more symbolic, this general sense of fire, rather than the specific image of the actual threat.
So it's like her subconscious took this raw, intuitive feeling of danger and translated it into a more familiar image, something her conscious mind could grasp fire.
That's how Bozzano interprets it. He suggests that telepathic impressions often take the path of least resistance, shaped by the receiver's own experiences, their sensory leanings, their personal way of understanding the world.
It makes sense when you think about it. It's like the psychic signal gets filtered through our individual perception. Speaking of individual perception, there's this really interesting case from the narrator herself, involving her dog Megatherium, or Meg for short. This one deals with an auditory premonition, a sound that wasn't actually there.
Ah, yes. So the narrator is asleep, and she suddenly wakes up to the very distinct sound of Meg jumping into her daughter's room. But here's the thing, the bedroom door is closed, and Meg isn't even inside. The narrator's husband also heard the sound.
So they both heard this phantom jumping. That's creepy. And wasn't there a sense of foreboding, like a premonition of something bad happening?
There was. Right at that moment, the narrator had this overwhelming feeling that Meg had died.
Oh no. And she didn't even get up to check.
She hesitated, it was a cold night, and the whole experience had a kind of dreamlike quality to it, so she eventually just went back to sleep.
That's so heartbreaking, especially knowing what we know now. But Bozzano offers a really insightful interpretation of this case, doesn't he?
He does. He points out that a dying animal in distress would likely focus its thoughts on its owners, those who could potentially help. So the urgent need for assistance didn't manifest as a literal image of danger, but as this familiar sound of Meg's jumps, a sound associated with comfort, routine, the expectation of seeing her beloved humans.
It's like Meg's subconscious was trying to bridge the gap, to reach out in a way that her owner would understand, even if it was indirect.
Exactly. It suggests a certain intelligence at play, even in those final moments. Now, the next case, involving Miss Lubo Krzyżanowski and her sister Wera's dog, Bonica, has both auditory and visual aspects that add a whole other layer of complexity.
I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
So Miss Lubo Krzyżanowski is in her home, and she distinctly hears Bonica caulk in the next room. But here's the catch Bonica had left with her sister and mother earlier that morning. At the same time, Wera, who is holding Bonica, perceives this fleeting, pale light near the door at the exact moment that Bonica dies.
Okay, this is getting seriously weird. So they're both experiencing phenomena related to Bonica, even though she's not physically present in either location. It seems like we're moving beyond simple telepathic communication between a pet and its owner.
You're right. It gets even trickier because in this case, Bonica was actually with her owner when she passed away. So the usual sense of urgency, the need to reach out for help, doesn't quite apply. Bozzano points out that this case is similar to what's sometimes observed in human deathbed phenomena.
What do you mean?
Well, sometimes a dying person, just by thinking of familiar places or loved ones, might unconsciously send out some kind of telepathic impression, without intentionally trying to communicate anything specific. It's almost like a final, involuntary echo of their connection to those people and places.
So maybe that's what was happening with Bonica. Her final thoughts, her connection to her home and family, were somehow projected outward, even though she was physically with her owner.
That's one possibility. Bozzano also briefly considers a more spiritualistic explanation, which is sometimes proposed for humans, where a person's spirit, after death, might revisit familiar places or appear to loved ones.
And what about the pale light that Wera saw? Does that fit into the picture somehow?
It's hard to say for sure. The source acknowledges that this luminous phenomenon, while not directly related to telepathic animal perception, is still intriguing because similar lights are often reported at the moment of human death. It might hint at some energetic aspect of the dying process, something beyond our current understanding.
Definitely adds to the mystery. Now, case number 7 delves into the possibility of post-mortem appearances, the idea of animal ghosts. It involves the narrator's experience with her dog, Morna.
So the narrator has given Morna to a new owner. Sometime later, she's back in her old home and sees Morna running and playing, just like she used to when she lived there. What's interesting is that no one else in the family saw this, and later the narrator finds out that Morna died around the same time from injuries she got in a dogfight.
So it seems like she might have caught a glimpse of Morna's spirit revisiting a place she loved. I imagine there could be a lot of skepticism about this kind of story, right?
You bet. Bozzano anticipates this and mentions that he'll later present more examples of postmortem animal apparitions, cases where multiple people saw the same thing, or where people who didn't know each other reported similar experiences. He's building a case for the reality of these phenomena, addressing potential objections along the way.
Smart move. Solid research. Case number 8 takes us to a hotel room and a father's visual experience of his deceased dog.
In this case, the father sees his little dog run through the room and then vanish without interacting with anything or anyone. The source contrasts this with Morna, who seemed to be actively enjoying being back in her old home. This sighting was more fleeting, more passive.
So more like a brief, almost residual image, like a memory flickering to life.
Exactly. Bozzano compares it to purely hallucinatory telepathic experiences, a passive imprint rather than an interactive presence.
Now, case number 9 is a pretty intense one. It involves Mr. G. Grazer and his St. Bernard. This one goes beyond just visual experiences, right?
Yeah, this one has tactile and even telekinetic elements, suggesting a more forceful presence. So Mr. Grazer is at home, and he's suddenly gripped with this overwhelming sense of dread, this intuitive knowledge that his dog is in danger. He immediately calls the slaughterhouse and finds out that his dog was just killed.
Oh, no. I can't even imagine. So what happens next?
As if to confirm his worst fears, right around the time the dog was killed, Mr. Grazer's room door swings open on its own, and he has this distinct feeling of the dog lying at his feet.
Whoa, wait a minute. The door opened by itself. That's seriously spooky. It suggests some kind of interaction with the physical world.
And that's what makes this case so intriguing. The source proposes that because the dog's death was so violent and recent, there might have been a more powerful release of energy, maybe even a manifestation of the animal's paraspirit. It's a term used in spiritualist circles, referring to a kind of energetic body that survives physical death. The idea is that this surge of energy might have allowed the dog's spirit to have more tangible effect, like opening the door.
Okay, now that's just straight up fascinating. Case number 10 brings us back to visual telepathy, this time with Reverend Ellis G. Roberts' daughter and her Irish fox terrier, Patty.
Okay, picture this. The daughter is at home, and she sees Patty come into the garden, walk into the house, and then just disappear. No one else in the house saw him. Later that day, Patty actually returns, but he's in really bad shape, all banged up and injured.
Oh, poor Patty. So was the vision a kind of premonition, a glimpse of him returning home injured?
That's the source's interpretation, a telepathic message from Patty, even though it wasn't a direct representation of the injury itself.
So maybe his need for help, his desire to return home, was translated into this image of him actually arriving at the house.
That's the idea. It highlights how these perceptions might work on a symbolic level, not always a literal representation of the situation. Case 11 is kind of a head-scratcher. It doesn't neatly fit into any of the other categories. It's about the narrator seeing a double of her Angora cat jumping over the fence.
A double, like a doppelganger cat.
Pretty much. So she's holding her cat, and out of the corner of her eye, she sees what looks like an identical cat jump over the fence. She couldn't find any trace of the other cat afterwards, and at the time, she didn't know anything about spiritualism or any of these concepts.
It's like a glitch in the Matrix.
Yeah.
A glimpse into another dimension or something. Case number 12 involves a dog's behavior in response to its owner being injured and then passing away. This is the one recounted by Baron Joseph de Kronhelm, right?
That's the one. It really emphasizes an animal's deep sensitivity to its owner's emotional state. The dog started acting really excited, like he usually did when a family member returned home. But then he suddenly looked confused and even scared, almost like he was sensing something was wrong.
So he went from joyful anticipation to something more like fear or confusion.
Exactly. Bozzano calls this expressive mimicry, and he suggests that the dog was genuinely picking up on the owner's changing state, even if it couldn't consciously understand death. It's like he sensed the shift from life to death, and it freaked him out.
That's a pretty profound observation. Now, case 13 is a real tearjerker. It involves a sailor's dog and its reaction to hearing the owner's whistle after the ship had sunk.
So the sailor's mother and aunt are at home, and they get news that the ship went down. That night, they both hear the sound of the sailor's dog whistle coming from upstairs. Their dog, which was downstairs, immediately starts barking excitedly and runs upstairs, obviously associating the sound with its beloved owner.
Oh man, that's heartbreaking. The dog was clearly hoping its owner had somehow returned.
It's a powerful example of the enduring bond between humans and animals, and the way familiar sensory cues can evoke those deep emotional connections, even in the face of loss. Case number 14 takes us to a more dramatic encounter, a horse reacting with pure terror to the apparition of a deceased man.
This is one of those cases where the animal senses seem to be keener than ours, right?
You got it. So they're riding along in a carriage, and suddenly the horse freaks out, stops dead in its tracks, starts trembling, and refuses to move forward. Then the people in the carriage see the apparition of their deceased friend who they were on their way to visit.
Wait, so the horse saw the ghost first? That's wild.
It is. And Bozzano uses this case to suggest that animals might have subconscious supernormal abilities, kind of sixth sense, that allows them to perceive things beyond our normal human perception. Maybe they're picking up on subtle energies or vibrations that we're just not tuned into.
Makes you wonder what else they're sensing that we're missing. Case number 15 is about a dog that reacts with intense fear to unseen figures in a room.
Yeah, so this dog is just hanging out with its owner, and all of a sudden, it gets really agitated, starts growling, and then hides under a sofa. Then the owner sees these vague shapes, silhouettes of 3 human figures.
So the dog was reacting to something that the owner couldn't see at first. That's interesting.
It is, and the source points out that the dog's reaction was one of fear, not aggression. Typically, a dog might bark or growl at an intruder, but this dog was clearly terrified and trying to hide.
It does make you wonder what it was sensing. Case 16 is another one where a dog seems to be reacting to something that the humans don't see right away. It involves a dog barking at a fireplace.
Right. So there's a group of people in a room with a fireplace, and their dog starts barking like crazy at the fireplace. And then all of a sudden, they all see the apparition of a deceased person standing in the fireplace.
So the dog was the first one to notice. It's like the dog's senses were heightened, more attuned to whatever was causing that apparition to manifest.
And the fact that multiple witnesses corroborated the dog's reaction makes it even more compelling. Now, case 17 is a really detailed one, drawing on Professor James Harslop's investigation. A woman senses the presence of her deceased cousin, and there's a whole sequence of sensory experiences leading up to her actually seeing the apparition.
Okay, I'm ready for the spooky details.
So people in the house start hearing heavy footsteps, and there's this sudden cold breeze. Then the family dog starts acting really scared, and finally the woman sees the apparition of her cousin.
Whoa! So the dog was the first to sense something was off. It's like we keep seeing this pattern that animals are reacting to something that the humans haven't quite perceived yet.
And to make things even more interesting, all of this happened about an hour after they received a telegram announcing the cousin's death. The source discusses the possibility of what's called retarded telepathy, meaning the telepathic impression was delayed.
So maybe the cousin's thoughts, his energy, his presence, took some time to travel or manifest?
Possibly. It challenges our usual understanding of time and communication. Now, the final case in this set is another personal experience from the narrator. Her dog reacts to something unseen in her room. Her dog starts acting really agitated, growling at the door like he sees someone there. Then, a little while later, the narrator's sister comes into the room, and the dog calms down. The weird thing is, there was no indication that anyone was outside the door or even nearby.
It's like the dog sensed someone was about to arrive.
Yeah.
Even before they were physically present. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with these cases of individual perception. Now let's get into the really juicy stuff. Collective perceptions, where both humans and animals seem to be reacting to the same unusual event.
Right. This is where the evidence gets even stronger because it's harder to dismiss these experiences as just individual hallucinations.
So it's not just one person and their pet having a weird moment. It's multiple people and animals all reacting to something inexplicable.
Precisely. And it suggests that there's something objective happening, something that's independent of individual perception. Case 19 features Dr. Justinus Kerner's observations of the seeress of Prevorst, who was known for her psychic abilities.
I've heard of her. She had some pretty intense experiences, right?
She did. And what's interesting is that whenever she'd announced that she was sensing a presence, a spirit, the family greyhound would immediately react with fear, as if it was also perceiving something unusual.
So the dog wasn't just picking up on the seeress's cues, her emotions. It was independently reacting to the same unseen presence.
That's what it seems like. It's like they were both tuned into the same frequency, picking up on something beyond our normal senses. And after the first time this happened, the dog became noticeably more anxious about being alone at night. It's like those experiences left a lasting impression, a sense of unease.
Case 20 involves a woman who sees the apparition of someone she had wronged in the past, and at the same time, her dog reacts aggressively towards the same spot.
Right. The woman, Mrs. T, sees the apparition, and at that exact moment, her dog, Beppo, starts growling and lunging at the empty space where the apparition appeared.
So it wasn't just that the dog was mirroring his owner's fear or anxiety. He was having his own independent reaction to the apparition. I mean, dogs don't typically act aggressively toward thin air.
Exactly. And case 21 is another one of the narrator's personal experiences, this time involving the apparition of someone named Palladia and her dog's reaction to it.
I'm sensing a theme here. A lot of the narrator's own experiences making it into the book must have been quite a life.
It certainly seems that way. So in this case, the narrator sees Palladia and actually hears her speak. At the same time, her dog gets super freaked out, starts bristling, hides, and stares intently in the direction of the apparition. And this particular dog rarely barks, so his reaction was especially noticeable.
If I remember correctly, there was another witness in the house, a guest, who also had an experience related to Palladia.
You've got a good memory. The guest reported hearing something unusual, and later revealed that they too had seen Palladia that same day.
So we've got the narrator seeing and hearing the apparition, the dog having a strong fear response, and then a guest who both hears and sees Palladia. That's a lot of independent corroboration. It makes it hard to dismiss as just a figment of someone's imagination.
Right. Case 22 involves a dog reacting to something that the narrator and another person, Mr. Davis, can't see, but two young ladies in the house do see.
This is one of those cases where it seems like different people are perceiving the same thing in different ways, right?
You got it. So the dog starts barking like crazy, all scared. Then these two young ladies report seeing a familiar spirit form. What's key here is that the dog's reaction happened before the women saw the apparition, suggesting it wasn't influenced by their perception.
It's like the dog was picking up on something even more subtle, some kind of precursor to the visual manifestation that the women experienced.
And to add another layer, a young child in the house then points to a spot near the door and says he sees a man and then looks surprised, as if the man suddenly vanished.
It's like everyone's getting bits and pieces of the same event, but in their own way, through their own sensory filters. Case 23 is another of the narrator's experiences where his dog growls at a spot where he then sees a spirit form.
And the dog's reaction was that classic menacing growl, like when they sense an intruder or a threat. It reinforces this pattern of animals reacting first, almost like they're acting as sentinels, picking up on things that we miss.
Now, case 24 involves a whole family, the Montgomerys, having a collective visual experience of an apparition, and at the same time, their horse reacts dramatically.
All three members of the family simultaneously see the apparition, and at the same time, their horse, which was pulling their carriage, suddenly stops, starts shaking, and won't budge.
So not only are multiple humans seeing the same thing, but the horse is also reacting to it. That's some strong evidence.
Bozzano argues that in cases like this, where multiple humans and an animal all react in the same way at the same time, it becomes really hard to dismiss it as just imagination or hallucination.
Even if it's not the kind of hard scientific evidence that some people demand, the sheer number of these consistent accounts starts to paint a pretty compelling picture.
And case 25 takes us into the world of seances, with Dr. Akurovich observing both a dog and a cat reacting to unseen presences during these gatherings.
Seances. Always good for some spooky fun. What happened with the animals?
Well, at one seance, they're trying to contact a spirit, and this dog starts staring intently at an empty armchair and growling. Then a sleepwalker who is participating in the seance says that the girl they're trying to reach is gone, and the dog immediately calms down.
It's like the dog was picking up on the same subtle energy that the sleepwalker was perceiving.
And in another instance, there's a white cat in the dining room, and it gets startled by something under the table right where they were expecting a materialized spirit form to appear. The cat keeps looking at the spot and then jumps back and hides, all scared.
That's wild. It's like the animals were acting as these extrasensory confirmation devices, picking up on the same energies that the humans were trying to contact during the seance.
And it's interesting that the dog and the cat reacted in such different ways, suggesting that their perception of the unseen presence was also different.
Right. Case 26 involves Mr. Llewellyn seeing a blue light and his cat having a super freak-out reaction. This one highlights how different beings might perceive the same event in different ways.
So Mr. Llewellyn sees this blue light moving around in his house, and then his cat suddenly jumps off the bed, hisses, and starts scratching at the door like he's trying to get away from something terrifying.
Poor kitty. It sounds like something seriously spooked it.
But the source points out that just because the cat was terrified doesn't mean it saw something visually scary. It might have been picking up on something that was beyond our normal senses, something that triggered a primal fear response.
So both Mr. Llewellyn and the cat were reacting to the same underlying event, but their perception of it was different.
Exactly. It's like different facets of the same jewel. Now, the final case in this set, case 27, is a chilling one. It involves 3 dogs in a seemingly empty house.
Empty except for the ghosts, perhaps.
Well, in this case, 3 dogs start reacting with fear to these sudden howls, like someone's in distress, and there are these strong gusts of wind, even though all the doors and windows are closed. The dog's owner, who's sleeping in the house, doesn't hear a thing.
So the dogs are picking up on something that the human completely misses.
And to make it even creepier, the howls were similar to those that the family had heard at the time of the mother's death. And get this, the father died about 2 weeks after this incident.
Oh, wow. That's heavy. It's like the dogs were sensing something, some kind of premonition of the father's impending death that the human just wasn't aware of.
It definitely adds to the unsettling nature of the story. And the source speculates that the father might have been in a sleepwalking state, which could explain why he didn't hear the disturbances that so terrified the dogs. Okay, now let's move into a category that's a little more symbolic and perhaps less about objective apparitions. Apparitions of animals in symbolic premonitory form.
So these are those cases where the appearance of an animal might be more of a psychological projection, perhaps related to beliefs or expectations about death.
Right. The source suggests that these are likely part of a broader metapsychic symbolism, often tied to family traditions or folklore, where certain animals are seen as harbingers of death.
Okay, so less about literal animal ghosts and more about how our minds might interpret these symbolic images.
Exactly. Case 28 is a quick one. Mrs. E.L. Kearney sees this unusual-looking cat walking towards her, and then it vanishes behind a door that's always kept open.
Vanishes. Poof. Just like that.
Gone. Case 29 involves a dog that howls in a very specific way right before a family member who is already ill passes away.
So this is more about the timing and the specific nature of the dog's howling, suggesting some kind of intuitive awareness.
Right. The source argues that it goes beyond just coincidence. It's like the dog sensed the impending death, even if the person was already sick. Case 30 involves 3 separate instances of dogs howling right before the unexpected deaths of their owners.
So multiple dogs, multiple owners, same premonitory howling, that does start to feel like more than just a random coincidence.
It does. And case 31 is from the narrator's childhood. His sheepdog starts howling mournfully and then dies shortly before its elderly owner passes away. 10 years later, during a seance, there's a reported apparition of the dog.
Wow. So this one kind of bridges the gap between premonition and the possibility of an animal spirit lingering after death, which leads us perfectly into our next section, hauntings, where animals seem to be reacting to a persistent presence.
And these cases really highlight how animals can act as independent witnesses to these phenomena. Cases 32 through 37 all involve animals exhibiting clear signs of fear or agitation in places that are believed to be haunted.
It's like they're picking up on something that's beyond our normal human perception, those subtle energies or vibrations that we might miss.
Right. And their reactions are often quite specific, refusing to enter certain rooms, hiding.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel